I opened a certified letter addressed to a man I hadn't spoken to in 20 years, and the county clerk's hands actually shook when she pulled his file. There was $2,340,000 sitting in a trust with his name on it, and according to the paperwork in front of both of us, I was still his legal wife. Good day, listeners. It's Deborah here. Before I continue, like and subscribe and leave your comment. My name is Deborah Ann Prescott. I'm 54 years old, and I've lived in Toledo, Ohio my whole life, in the same 3-mile radius if you want to know the truth. Point Place first, then a rental on Bancroft, and for the last 18 years a small brick 2-bedroom on Detrick Avenue with a chain-link fence and a maple tree that drops more helicopter seeds than any tree has a right to. I work as a medical billing coder at Mercy Health St. Vincent, 3rd floor cubicle by the window that doesn't open. I've been there 11 years. Before that, I did billing for a pediatric dental office for 9 years. And before that, when I was young and thought I had all the time in the world, I did claims processing for an insurance company that doesn't exist anymore. I tell people this because I want you to understand what kind of woman this happened to. Not a woman with a financial advisor, not a woman who reads the Wall Street Journal over coffee, a woman who clips coupons out of habit even when the savings only come to 90 cents, who drives a 2014 Toyota Corolla with 161,000 miles on it because it still runs, and a car payment is a car payment. I balance my checkbook by hand, on paper the old-fashioned way, because I don't trust the banking app to tell me the truth about what I have left before the 15th of the month. I raised one daughter, Melissa, mostly on my own. And for the last 14 months, I've had my grandson Tyler living with me. He's 14, going into 9th grade, and he has type 1 diabetes, diagnosed when he was 9. Melissa is a staff sergeant in the Air Force currently stationed on Guam, and when her deployment orders came down, we agreed it was easier, steadier, for Tyler to finish out these years with me than to bounce between temporary childcare arrangements 6,000 miles from home. I love that boy like he came out of my own body. I also do the math on his insulin every single month, and I will tell you plainly, the math is not generous. Here is the relationship I need you to understand, because it's the hinge this whole story swings on. 22 years ago, I was married to a man named Richard Prescott. Rick, everybody called him. We were married for 9 years. He was, for most of that time, exactly the kind of husband you'd want if somebody was building one out of spare parts. He fixed things before I noticed they were broken. He remembered my mother's birthday better than I did, and he had this quiet, patient way of listening that made you feel like you were the only interesting person in Lucas County. He worked as a machinist at a tool and D shop out on Alexis Road, and on weekends he tinkered in our garage with irrigation parts and valve fittings, an old hobby from his father, who'd been a farm equipment mechanic downstate. I used to tease him about the smell of cutting oil that never quite left his hands. We divorced when I was 32. It wasn't ugly particularly, or it didn't feel ugly at the time. He'd started pulling away maybe a year before that, longer hours at the shop. A post office box he opened that he said was for his tinkering supply orders, a temper that showed up out of nowhere over small things, like the time he nearly took the head off a delivery driver over a package left in the rain. I filed the papers, he signed them without a fight, which at the time I took as a mercy. We didn't have children together. Melissa was from my first marriage when I was 22, a marriage so short and so long ago it barely counts as backstory. Rick and I split up the furniture, split up the small joint savings account, and I never heard his voice again after the day he came to get his tools out of the garage. I heard secondhand through his cousin, who I ran into at a Kroger in 2009, that he'd moved out west somewhere, Nevada, she thought, or maybe Arizona. I filed him under the past and went on with my life. I want you to remember 3 small things because they didn't mean anything to me for 20 years, and then all at once they meant everything. The first, Rick never once in all our years together showed me the paperwork for that post office box, and after the divorce, when I mentioned it to my own divorce attorney just to be thorough, she told me she didn't see a P.O. box listed on any of his disclosed assets. I let it go. It was a small thing. The second, about 4 months before we filed, Rick asked me, almost like he was joking, almost like it didn't matter whether I'd ever thought about changing my name back to my maiden name if we split up. I remember laughing and saying, "Rick, we're not even fighting right now. Why are you asking me that?" He shrugged it off. I never thought about that conversation again until I had a very good reason to. The third, the day the divorce was finalized, or the day I believed it was finalized, Rick handed me a manila folder of copies for my records, he said, and told me not to bother filing them anywhere important. He'd already taken care of the county filing himself, since he was going down there anyway for a work permit. I remember being grateful. One less errand. I didn't think about any of that for 2 decades. I built a whole life on the other side of it. And then, on a Tuesday morning in March, all 3 of those small things came roaring back at once in a fluorescent-lit government building that smells like burnt coffee and toner. It started with a certified letter. March 11th, a Wednesday actually, I'm correcting myself because I've told this story enough times now that I want to get the small details right. The letter came from something called Sierra Trust and Fiduciary Services out of Reno, Nevada, and it was addressed to Deborah A. Prescott, surviving spouse of Richard W. Prescott. My hands went cold reading that word, surviving. I hadn't known Rick was dead. Nobody had told me. I stood in my own driveway holding my mail in one hand and Tyler's insulin delivery box in the other, and I read the words surviving spouse 4 times before they made any sense. The letter said, in the dry, over-formal language lawyers use, that the firm represented the trustee of an asset held for the benefit of Richard W. Prescott's legal heirs, that Mr. Prescott had passed away 11 months earlier in Washoe County, Nevada, and that county records identified me as his spouse of record, since no divorce decree could be located in Lucas County, Ohio. They requested that I contact them at my earliest convenience regarding disposition of the estate. I did not sleep that night. I want to be honest with you about that. I lay in bed with the letter on my nightstand like it might do something if I looked away from it, and I ran through every version of what this could mean. A scam, I thought first. I'd read about these. The ones that prey on women my age, promising an inheritance if you'll just wire a small processing fee. But the letterhead had a real Nevada bar number on it, a real address I could look up, and something about the phrase "no divorce decree could be located" itched at the back of my mind in a way that had nothing to do with money. The next morning, before work, I drove to the Lucas County Courthouse on Adams Street. I've walked past that building 100 times without ever going inside, and I remember thinking, standing in the security line with my purse going through the X-ray machine, that I felt ridiculous, a 54-year-old woman convinced she needed to double-check her own divorce. The records clerk's name was Patricia Yoder. I remember her name because I ended up talking to her 3 separate times before this was over, and because of the way her face changed that first morning. She typed Prescott, Richard W. and Prescott, Deborah A. into her terminal, cross-referenced by our 2004 case number, which I'd written down from my own copy of the decree the night before. She frowned at the screen, typed again, frowned harder. "Ma'am," she said, "I'm showing a petition for dissolution filed in 2004, case number DR04-1187. But I'm not showing a final decree entered. There's no judge's signature in the system, no final judgment." "That's not possible," I said. "I have the decree. I have a copy at home. It's signed. I've used it. I used it to change my name back on my driver's license. I used it, and then I stopped because I was hearing myself say I have a copy, not I have the original, and I was remembering a manila folder handed to me across a kitchen table 20 years ago, and a voice saying, 'Don't bother filing them anywhere. I already took care of it.'" Patricia pulled the physical case file from archive storage. It took almost 40 minutes, and I sat in a hard plastic chair in the hallway with my coat still on, my whole body strangely still, the way you get still right before something is confirmed. When she came back out, she had the file open in her hands, and she was not making eye contact with me in the friendly way she had been an hour before. "There's a petition," she said, sliding the folder across the counter so I could see for myself. "There's a filing fee receipt, there's your signature, and what looks like his signature on the petition itself. But the final decree page, the one that actually dissolves the marriage, it was never filed. There's a blank space where the judge's signature should be, and a note here in the margin, dated about 3 weeks after the petition, that says petitioner requests case be held, We'll refile. Do you know anything about that? I did not know anything about that. I told her so. My voice came out steadier than I expected, which surprised me, because inside my chest felt like it had been dropped down a flight of stairs. So legally, I said very slowly, testing each word before I let it out of my mouth, we were never divorced. Patricia looked at me with the particular kind of pity reserved for people who've just found out their whole timeline is wrong. Legally, she said, based on what's in this file, no, ma'am. It doesn't look like you were. I asked her, because I had to, because the letter in my purse was burning a hole through the lining. Does that mean I'm his? Was I his widow? When he died? That would be a question for a probate attorney, she said, but based on county records, as of the date of his death, yes, you'd have been his legal spouse of record. Nobody filed anything showing otherwise. I want to tell you the exact number because the exact number is the reason you're listening to this story right now, and vague numbers don't do justice to what a moment like that feels like. $2,340,000. That was the figure written in the certified letter described as trust corpus and accrued but undistributed royalty income attached to something called Meridian Fluid Systems LLC, a company I had never heard my ex-husband, my apparently not ex-husband, mention a single time in the 9 years I was married to him. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking garage for 25 minutes before I could make myself turn the key. I didn't call anyone. I didn't cry exactly, though my eyes were doing something in that direction. I just sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, staring at a concrete pillar with a faded number 4C painted on it, running the number $2,340,000 through my head over and over, next to the memory of Rick's hand sliding a manila folder across our kitchen table and his voice saying, "Easy as anything. Don't bother filing them anywhere important. I already took care of it." He hadn't taken care of it. He had taken care of himself. I didn't tell anyone that first night. Not Melissa, 6,000 miles away on Guam with enough on her plate. Not my sister Carla, who would have had the whole extended family calling me within the hour. Not even Tyler, though he noticed something was off. He's a sharp kid. He clocked that I burned the garlic bread and forgot to ask about his blood sugar log, 2 things I never forget. I told him I had a headache. It wasn't exactly a lie. I sat at my kitchen table that night. The same table, different house, but somehow it felt like the same table Rick had slid that folder across 2 decades earlier, and I made myself do what I do best. I made a list, not of feelings, of facts, what I knew. Rick had died 11 months earlier in Washoe County, Nevada. Legally, according to Lucas County's own records, we had never finished the divorce. There was a trust holding something over $2 million, tied to a company called Meridian Fluid Systems LLC that I'd never heard of, and there was a manila folder, real, physical, sitting somewhere in a box in my attic that I now needed to find, because I remembered exactly what Rick had told me about it, and I needed to know if I'd been lied to for 20 years or if I'd simply misunderstood something back then. What I didn't know filled a much longer list. Why hadn't the divorce gone through? Had Rick sabotaged it on purpose, or had it been some kind of clerical accident that nobody caught for 2 decades? Where had $2 million come from? A machinist's salary and a garage hobby didn't add up to that kind of money. Not in 100 years. Who else knew about this trust? Because a certified letter addressed to surviving spouse told me somebody somewhere had already been sorting through Rick's affairs and had found my name attached to them, which meant somebody else might already know I existed and might not be happy about it. I want to be honest about the fear because I think it's the part people skip over when they tell stories like this. I wasn't afraid of the money running out or the math not working, not that night. I was afraid of being made a fool of. I was afraid that somewhere out west, Rick had built an entire second life, a second wife maybe, children, a version of himself I'd never met, and that I was about to walk into the middle of it as an unwelcome, embarrassing ghost from his past. The woman who didn't know her own divorce had never gone through. I thought about Tyler's insulin. I thought about my job where Mercy Health had just announced a merger with a regional hospital system, and everyone on the 3rd floor had been quietly refreshing their email for 2 weeks, waiting to see whose position would survive the administrative consolidation. I thought about the fact that if this went badly, if this turned out to be some kind of scam or some kind of legal trap, I could lose money I didn't have chasing money that was never really mine to begin with. And underneath all of that, quieter, was the thing that kept me up until nearly 3 in the morning. That folder. Don't bother filing them anywhere important. I already took care of it. 22 years I had trusted that sentence. I got up, went up into the attic in my bathrobe with a flashlight, and dug through 4 boxes of old paperwork until I found it. A faded manila folder, my old handwriting on the tab that just said Divorce 04 inside were copies. Just copies. A copy of the petition. A copy of a proposed final decree unsigned with a note clipped to the front in Rick's handwriting that I hadn't looked at closely in 20 years. D. Hold on to these for your records. We'll send you the filed copy once the judge signs off. R. He never sent me the filed copy because there wasn't one. Because I was starting to understand, sitting on my attic floor in the middle of the night with dust on my knees, Rick Prescott had never actually finished divorcing me at all. And for 22 years, that fact had apparently been sitting quietly in a courthouse file, waiting for a letter from Nevada to wake it back up. I didn't sleep, but by the time the sun came up, I had a decision made, and it was the only decision that felt like me. I wasn't going to call that trust company back with excitement, and I wasn't going to call them back with panic. I was going to find a lawyer first, and I was going to go into this the way I go into everything, slowly, on paper, with documentation, and without letting anybody rush me into signing something before I understood exactly what I was signing. I found Wanda Jean Fitch through the Toledo Bar Association's referral line. And I thank God for whoever runs that phone tree, because I could not have ordered up a better ally if I'd built her myself. Wanda Jean was 61, had practiced probate and family law in Lucas County for 34 years, and wore a pair of reading glasses on a beaded chain that she took off and put back on with the rhythm of a woman conducting an orchestra, off when she was listening to you, on when she was about to say something you needed to hear whether you wanted to or not. Her office was above a shuttered dry cleaner on Monroe Street, and the first thing she said to me before have a seat was, "Well, don't sit down looking like somebody died. Somebody already died sounds like the question is what he left behind and whether it's actually yours." I told her everything. The letter, the courthouse, the unsigned decree, the manila folder. Wanda Jean listened without interrupting, glasses off the whole time, and when I finished she took a long breath, put the glasses back on and said, "Okay, first thing, you didn't do anything wrong. I want that said out loud before we go one step further, because women in your position spend the first 2 weeks apologizing for something that isn't their fault, and I don't have the patience for it. Second thing, this is going to be slow. Probate is slow on a good day, and this is not going to be a good day. Third thing, somebody out there already knows you exist because that letter didn't write itself. So we move carefully and we move on paper. Wanda Jean's first move was simple and, she told me, almost always the right first move. She filed a formal request with the Nevada Trust Company for a full accounting, and she opened her own inquiry with the Nevada Secretary of State's Business Registry for anything filed under Rick's name or Meridian Fluid Systems LLC. It took 11 days to get anything back, and when it came back, it opened up more questions than it answered. Meridian Fluid Systems LLC had been formed in Nevada in March of 2006, 2 years after our divorce petition had been filed and quietly abandoned, 1 year after I'd last heard anything about Rick through his cousin at that Kroger. The registered agent was a Reno-based business services company, the kind that exists specifically to keep an owner's name off public paperwork, but buried in a 2009 amendment filing, the kind of document most people would skim past, was a single-line listing R. Prescott, managing member, alongside a second name I did not recognize, Carol Ann Whitfield. Do you know that name? Wanda Jean asked me, sliding the printout across her desk. I didn't. I'd never heard it in my life. Well, Wanda Jean said, taking her glasses off and cleaning them on her blazer, a habit I'd learned meant she was about to deliver something unpleasant. I did some digging while we were waiting on the state filing, because I don't like sitting on my hands. There's a woman named Carol Ann Whitfield who filed for a name change in Washoe County in 2010, from Carol Ann Meeker to Carol Ann Prescott. And there's an obituary from last April in the Reno Gazette-Journal for a Richard William Prescott, survived, and I'm quoting here, by his beloved wife of 14 years, Carol Prescott. I sat very still, 14 years. Rick had apparently been telling an entire second community in Nevada that he had a wife named Carol for 14 years, which meant he'd started calling her his wife around 2010, 6 years after our divorce petition was filed and never finished, and 4 years after he'd quietly formed a company that would, it now appeared, come to hold over $2 million.
She's not actually his wife, I said slowly, working it out loud. The way you do when a thing is too big to hold quietly in your own head. Because he was never divorced from me, which means Wanda Jean said that Ms. Whitfield's marriage to Mr. Prescott, if there was ever a formal ceremony, was not legally valid, because he had an existing, undissolved marriage at the time. Bigamy, plainly put, though I doubt anyone's going to be filing criminal charges on a dead man.
But it matters enormously for probate, Deborah, because it means you, not her, are the surviving spouse of record. And in the state of Nevada, a surviving spouse has rights to marital and community property that a woman who was never legally married does not have, no matter how many years she wore his ring. I want to tell you honestly that this didn't feel like a victory in that moment. It felt like grief for a woman I'd never met, who had apparently spent 14 years believing she was married to a man who could never have legally married her because he never finished cleaning up after the last woman he left behind me. I remember saying something like that to Wanda Jean, and I remember her looking at me over the top of her glasses and saying, not unkindly, "You can grieve for her later."
Right now, you need to worry about her lawyer.
She was right to worry, and it didn't take long to find out why. 3 weeks into the inquiry, right around the time Wanda Jean's letter formally notifying the trustee of my claim as surviving spouse hit the trust company's desk in Reno, I got a phone call at work, on my cell, during my lunch break in the Mercy Health cafeteria. A man's voice, smooth, introduced himself as Gregory Handler, representing the interests of the Prescott estate and Mrs. Prescott. He did not say Carol Ann Whitfield's actual legal name. He called her Mrs. Prescott, the way you'd say a fact everybody already agreed on. "I understand there's been some confusion about a filing back in Ohio," he said in a tone that made the word confusion sound like an inconvenience I'd personally caused. "I'd strongly encourage you to consider whether it's worth putting an elderly widow through a contested estate matter over what was clearly, by all accounts, an amicable separation 20 years ago. There may be a modest settlement available if you're willing to sign a release and step away quietly. I'd frame this as an opportunity to avoid a great deal of unpleasantness. I did not sign anything. I did not say much of anything at all, actually, except that any communication should go through my attorney, and I gave him Wanda Jean's office number and hung up. My hands were shaking by the time I put the phone down on the cafeteria table. Not from fear exactly, more from the particular fury of being spoken to like a problem to be managed. Elderly widow. Carol Ann Whitfield was 58 years old. I'd later learn 4 years younger than she wanted people to believe when it was convenient for sympathy. When I told Wanda Jean about the call, she wrote everything down, date, time, exact phrasing, the works. "Good," she said. "Document it. That's the whole game here, Deborah. Everything on paper, everything dated, nothing verbal that isn't backed up by a note the same day it happened. Men like Gregory Handler make their living. Hoping women get scared and quiet. You're not going to be quiet. You're just going to be careful." Careful took time, and time was the one thing I felt like I didn't have. 2 weeks after that phone call, Mercy Health announced the first wave of layoffs from the merger, 41 positions across administrative and billing departments, effective in 90 days. My supervisor, a decent enough woman named Angela Ruiz, pulled me aside on a Thursday and told me, off the record, that my position was under review, which in hospital language means exactly what you think it means. I sat in my car in the parking garage again, a different parking garage this time, but I was starting to notice how much of this story happened to me in parking garages and did the math I always do. Without my job, I lost my insurance. Without my insurance, Tyler's insulin, his pump supplies, his endocrinologist visits, All of it became a monthly bill of over $1,100 that I did not have, not without a paycheck behind it. Somewhere in Nevada, there might have been over $2 million with my name attached to it, and I was still lying awake calculating whether COBRA coverage for one teenage boy would eat my entire severance in 4 months or 5. I didn't tell Wanda Jean about the layoff notice right away, mostly out of a stubborn kind of pride, but she guessed something was wrong from the way I kept asking, every single meeting, how much longer this would take. "I can't make Nevada probate court move faster because your hospital is having a bad quarter," she told me gently, the third time I asked. "But I can tell you this, the longer this drags, the more it costs Carol Ann Whitfield and Gregory Handler, too. Delay isn't automatically your enemy here. Sometimes it's theirs. People who are hiding something get impatient before people who are telling the truth do." She was right about that, though it took the next month to prove it. Wanda Jean's investigator, a retired Reno police records clerk named Hector Salinas, who did probate support work on the side, and who Wanda Jean swore by, started pulling threads on Meridian Fluid Systems LLC's actual business, which was where the story stopped being about who was married to whom and started being about where $2 million had actually come from. It turned out my ex-husband, my apparently never quite ex-husband, had done something with his life after he left Toledo that none of us back home ever knew about. The garage tinkering with irrigation valve fittings, the thing I used to tease him about, the thing his father had taught him growing up on a farm downstate Rick had kept at it out west, refined a self-flushing filter valve design for large-scale agricultural drip irrigation, and in 2007 he'd been granted a U.S. patent for it, filed under his own name, patent number US 7318 XX-LIX, self-cleaning filtration valve assembly for irrigation systems. Hector found the patent filing in about 20 minutes on a public database. In 2008, he'd licensed that patent to a company called AgriFlow Corporation, based in Fresno, California, in exchange for an ongoing royalty on every unit sold, and Meridian Fluid Systems, LLC, it turned out, was the holding entity Rick had set up specifically to receive those royalty payments and shield them from public record. The valve had done well. Not spectacularly, not overnight, but drip irrigation had exploded across California, Arizona, and parts of Texas in the years since, thanks to water restrictions and drought regulations, and Rick's little self-cleaning filter, licensed on a per-unit royalty, had quietly generated more money every single year for over a decade. By the time he died, the trust held $2,340,000. Some of it accrued royalty income that had simply built up faster than it was ever spent. The rest structured as the corpus of a trust his own attorney out in Nevada had set up in 2015, apparently on Rick's instruction, for the benefit of my lawful spouse and heirs, language that Wanda Jean pointed out with something close to satisfaction, Rick himself had chosen. He knew, she said, tapping the trust document with one finger. "Somebody doesn't write lawful spouse into a trust instrument by accident, Deborah. A trust attorney uses that phrase deliberately, usually because the client specifically told them to. Either your husband knew right up until he died that his divorce from you never went through, or somebody advised him it hadn't. And he built this trust anyway using language broad enough to cover exactly the situation you're in right now. That detail sat with me for a long time. It meant one of two things, and I genuinely could not decide which one I preferred. Either Rick had spent 2 decades quietly aware that he'd never actually divorced me, building a fortune off a valve he'd tinkered with in our old garage, and simply never told me, never sent a dime, never so much as a Christmas card, or he had at some point near the end of his life found out the truth about the botched filing and made a conscious choice in the language of his own trust to leave the door open for me. I didn't get an answer to that question until much later in this story, and I promise you when it came, it was not the answer I expected. What I got instead, about 5 weeks into the investigation, was a visit. I came home from work. Angela Ruiz had just told me that morning that my review would be finalized within 3 weeks, one way or the other, and there was a woman sitting in a gray sedan across the street from my house on Detrick Avenue. She got out when she saw me pull into the driveway. She was maybe 5'4", silver blonde hair cut in a sharp bob, wearing the kind of tailored coat that doesn't come from a Toledo strip mall. I knew who she was before she said a word. "Deborah Prescott?" she said. Her voice had a slight rasp to it, like she'd smoked for a lot of years and quit late. "I'm Carol Whitfield." I stood by my car door with my purse still on my shoulder and Tyler's insulin delivery and a bag in my other hand, and I said, "I know who you are. I flew here on my own dime," she said, "because I wanted to look at the woman who's trying to take my husband's estate away from me in person." Her hands were clenched at her sides, not shaking exactly, but held very tight the way you hold your hands when you're working hard to keep your voice level. 14 years, Mrs. Prescott. I was with him for 14 years. I nursed him through 2 heart surgeries. I planned his funeral. And now some woman from Ohio he hadn't spoken to in 20 years shows up with a lawyer wanting half of everything he built. I want you to know that I felt for her standing there on my own front walk, and I still feel for her now telling you this story. I believe she loved him. I believe, in her own understanding of her own life, she was his wife in every way that mattered to her. But I also had a 14-year-old boy inside my house checking his blood sugar, and a job that was going to disappear in 3 weeks, and a manila folder in my attic with Rick's handwriting on it, promising me a filing that never happened. I did not owe her my guilt. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I understood this was painful, that I hadn't asked for any of this either, and that any further conversation needed to go through our attorneys. She told me, before she got back in her car, that I would regret dragging this out, and that her lawyer was going to make sure the whole state of Nevada knew exactly what kind of woman abandons her husband for 20 years and then shows up for his money the second he's dead. Wanda Jean, when I called her that evening, wrote it all down again, word for word, the same as always. 2 days after that visit, Gregory Handler filed something in Washoe County probate court that Wanda Jean warned me was coming, but that still landed hard when it actually arrived. A formal challenge to my standing as surviving spouse, arguing that our marriage should be considered legally terminated based on 2 decades of complete estrangement and mutual abandonment, regardless of what the paper filing did or didn't say. Attached to it was a sworn statement from Carol Ann Whitfield asserting that Rick had told her repeatedly over their 14 years together that he was divorced years ago and that his ex-wife had remarried and moved on. It was, Wanda Jean told me, a real legal argument, not a nothing argument. Some states do recognize claims of abandonment or equitable estoppel in exactly these kinds of situations, and if a judge believed Carol's account of what Rick told her, it could complicate my claim considerably. This is the part of the story where Wanda Jean earned every dollar I eventually paid her, and where Hector Salinas, her investigator, found the thing that changed everything. Because a challenge like that opens the door to discovery. Both sides get to request records from each other. Under court supervision, Wanda Jean subpoenaed the trust company's full internal file on Meridian Fluid Systems LLC, everything, not just the summary letter I'd originally received. Buried in nearly 400 pages of bank statements, royalty disbursement records, and correspondence was a single email dated 14 months before Rick's death from Rick to his trust attorney in Reno, a man named Dennis Okafor. Hector found it because he read every single page instead of skimming, which is, Wanda Jean told me, 90% of what makes a good investigator good. In the email, Rick asked Dennis Okafor directly whether his 2004 Ohio divorce could be confirmed as finalized because, and this is close to his exact words, which Wanda Jean read out loud to me in her office with her glasses pushed up on her head, "I want to make sure everything's clean before Carol and I do anything more formal, and honestly, I'm not entirely sure the Ohio paperwork ever got fully closed out. Can you have someone check?" Dennis Okafor's reply, 3 days later, confirmed it in writing. Lucas County, Ohio records showed no final decree on file, and legally, under Nevada and Ohio law both, Richard remained married to Deborah Prescott. Okafor's email recommended Rick either finalize the old divorce properly before proceeding with anything involving Carol, or, at minimum, restructure his estate planning to account for the fact that I was legally still his wife. Rick never finalized the old divorce. He never told Carol the truth, as far as we could ever determine. But But 6 weeks after that email exchange, and this was the detail that undid Gregory Handler's entire abandonment argument, Rick had gone back to Dennis Okafor's office and revised his trust, adding the language "for the benefit of my lawful spouse and heirs" that Wanda Jean had flagged for me weeks earlier. He knew, not vaguely, not through some old rumor he'd half forgotten. He had it confirmed to him in writing 14 months before he died, and instead of coming clean to either of us, he'd quietly restructured his own estate to make sure that whatever else happened, the money would eventually find its way to me, the wife he'd never actually let go of on paper, even while he let another woman believe for 14 years that she held that title. I sat with that for a long time after Wanda Jean showed it to me. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like finally understanding a man I'd spent 20 years thinking I'd figured out, and realizing I never really had. Not the young Rick who fixed things before I noticed they broke, and not the old Rick who apparently spent the last year of his life quietly making sure I'd be taken care of without ever once picking up the phone to tell me so himself. "This is our gotcha," Wanda Jean said, sliding the printed email across her desk, glasses back down on her nose. This email and Dennis Okafor's reply. It proves Rick knew the marriage was live. It destroys any argument that he believed he was divorced. And it proves the later trust language was drafted with full knowledge of your status, which means Carol Whitfield's sworn statement, whatever she genuinely believes in her heart, doesn't match what her own husband told his own lawyer in writing. "Deborah, I think we're ready to stop playing defense." The confrontation happened at a mediation session, not a courtroom. Wanda Jean explained that Nevada probate judges push contested estates toward mediation before trial whenever possible, and given the strength of what Hector had found, she was confident we could resolve this without months more litigation. It was held in a conference room on the 11th floor of a law office in downtown Reno. In June, 3 months after that first certified letter had landed in my Toledo driveway, Wanda Jean flew out with me. I remember looking out the airplane window over the Nevada desert and thinking that I had never in my life been somewhere so dry, so different from the wet green flatness of Ohio, and wondering what it had been like for Rick to build a whole second existence somewhere so unlike the place we'd started out together. The room had a long table. A court-appointed mediator named Judge Elaine Marsh, retired, doing mediation work part-time, brisk and unsentimental in a way I appreciated, and, across the table, Carol Ann Whitfield in a charcoal suit, and Gregory Handler beside her in a tie that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Carol did not look at me when I sat down. Her hands were folded very tightly on the table in front of her. Judge Marsh laid out the framework. This was a chance to resolve the matter without further discovery costs or trial delays. Both sides had submitted position statements, and she would facilitate, not decide, unless the parties reached impasse. Gregory Handler opened with a restated version of the abandonment argument, smooth, confident, the same tone he'd used with me on the cafeteria phone call months earlier, that Rick and I had been functionally divorced in every sense but paper for 2 decades, that Carol had built a genuine 14-year marriage in good faith, and that equity demanded the estate be distributed according to what Rick actually intended, which he framed as an even split weighted heavily toward Carol's reliance and contribution. Wanda Jean let him finish completely. She did not interrupt once. When he was done, she took her glasses off, cleaned them slowly on her blazer. I'd learned by then exactly what that gesture meant and put them back on before she spoke. "I appreciate Mr. Handler's argument," she said, "and I'd find it a great deal more persuasive if it weren't directly contradicted by his own client's late husband's written correspondence with his own estate attorney." She slid copies of the email chain, Rick to Dennis Okafor, Okafor's reply, and the trust amendment dated 6 weeks later, down the table, one to Judge Marsh, one to Gregory Handler, one to Carol Whitfield herself. 14 months before Mr. Prescott's death, he confirmed directly with his own lawyer that his Ohio divorce had never been finalized and that my client remained his legal spouse. He then revised his trust to specifically protect my client's interest as his lawful spouse. This isn't a case of two people functionally divorced who simply never filed the last piece of paper. This is a case of a man who knew with certainty in writing that he was still married and who made an affirmative choice close to the end of his life to structure his estate around that knowledge without disclosing it to either woman in his life. The abandonment argument doesn't survive contact with Mr. Prescott's own words. I watched Carol Ann Whitfield read that email chain. I want to describe this carefully because it's the moment I think about most when people ask me what the climax of this whole ordeal actually felt like. It wasn't shouting, it wasn't tears, not there in that room anyway. It was her hand, her right hand resting on the table that gave her away. It had been perfectly still through Gregory Handler's whole opening statement, and as she read Rick's own handwriting confirmed in that email, asking whether their marriage could go forward once things are clean, her fingers curled slowly into a fist on the polished tabletop and stayed there, white-knuckled, while she kept reading. She did not look up for almost a full minute. When she finally did, she wasn't looking at me, she was looking at Gregory Handler. "Did you know about this?" she asked him, and her voice had lost every bit of the rasp and steel from our conversation in my driveway. It sounded, for the first time since I'd met her, like an ordinary woman who had just found out something devastating. Gregory Handler did not answer that question in front of Judge Marsh, which I think answered it for everyone in the room anyway. I stayed quiet through most of it. I'd promised myself on the plane out that whatever happened in that room, I was not going to raise my voice, not going to gloat, not going to say anything I'd regret in the retelling. When Judge Marsh finally turned to me and asked if I wanted to add anything, I said only this: I didn't come here to punish anyone. I came here because I found out completely by accident that I was legally still married to a man I hadn't spoken to in 20 years, and that he'd known it too and never told me. I'm not interested in taking away every dollar of a life Ms. Whitfield built. I'm interested in what's legally and fairly mine, and in getting an honest accounting of where this money came from. That's all I've wanted since the day that letter showed up. Judge Marsh called a recess. When we came back, Gregory Handler's tone had changed considerably, and within 2 hours, with Judge Marsh guiding both sides through the framework, we had the outline of a settlement. Here is what I legally walked away with, spelled out plainly, because I think specifics matter more than vague talk of a settlement. As Rick's surviving legal spouse, I was confirmed as the rightful beneficiary of the Meridian Fluid Systems Trust, rather than proceed to a full trial over the abandonment claim, which Gregory Handler's own client no longer had the stomach for. Once she understood what her husband had hidden from her, the parties agreed to a negotiated division. I received $1,690,000 outright, along with full ongoing rights to the AgriFlow royalty stream going forward, which Wanda Jean's financial consultant estimated at somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000 a year, depending on drought conditions and irrigation demand out west, for as long as the patent remained in force, another 11 years at that point. Carol Ann Whitfield retained $650,000 from the trust corpus, the house in Sparks, Nevada that she and Rick had shared, and this was the part Wanda Jean insisted on, and I agreed with her completely, a formal mutual non-disparagement agreement so that neither of us would spend the rest of our lives being dragged through gossip about the other. Gregory Handler's firm was referred to the Nevada State Bar for a review of his conduct regarding the pressure call he'd made to me back in March. Though Wanda Jean was honest with me that these referrals rarely amount to serious discipline, he did at minimum lose Carol Ann Whitfield as a client within a month of the mediation, which felt like its own small, quiet justice. I signed the final paperwork in Wanda Jean's office on Monroe Street on a Tuesday morning in July 4 months, almost to the day since that first certified letter had landed in my driveway. The wire transfer hit my new account. I'd opened one specifically for this at a different bank than my regular checking on Wanda Jean's advice, so you don't accidentally treat grocery money and inheritance money like they're the same pile. 3 business days later, I remember sitting at my kitchen table when the confirmation email came through, the same table where I'd made my list of facts on the worst night of this whole ordeal, and just breathing for a minute before I let myself feel anything at all. Mercy Health finalized my layoff 2 weeks after the mediation, right on schedule, completely unrelated to anything happening in Nevada. It would have wrecked me 4 months earlier. By the time it actually arrived, it barely registered as bad news at all. It's been just over a year now, and I want to tell you where everyone ended up because I think you've earned the full picture. I still live in the house on Dietrich Avenue, though it's paid off now, and I finally replaced the roof that had been on my worry list for 3 years. I left Mercy Health for good. I didn't need the severance panic job search I'd braced myself for. Instead, using a little over $180,000 of the settlement, I bought out a small independent medical billing consultancy from a woman named Frances Ott who was retiring, and I run it now, Prescott Billing Solutions, 3 employees and growing, working with small private practices around Northwest Ohio who can't afford the big billing conglomerates. I set my own hours. I have never once, not a single day, had to think about whether Tyler's insulin is covered. Tyler is 15 now, doing well, blood sugar steady, and he's taken an interest lately in engineering. I haven't told him yet, but part of me wonders if that's some strange echo of a grandfather he never met, tinkering with valve parts in a garage 2,000 miles away. Melissa finished her deployment on Guam and is stationed stateside now, close enough that she and Tyler are back under one roof, though he still comes to stay with me most weekends, which I wouldn't trade for anything. Wanda Jean Fitch still practices above the old dry cleaner on Monroe Street. I send her a Christmas card every year, and she still, without fail, sends one back with some dry one-liner about probate court scrawled inside. I consider her one of the great strokes of luck in my life, even though I found her during what felt, at the time, like the least lucky month I'd had in years. Carol Ann Whitfield and I exchanged one letter about 8 months after the mediation. She wrote first. It wasn't an apology. Exactly. I don't think she owed me one, not really. She was as much a person Rick kept in the dark as I once was, but it was honest, and I appreciated that. She said she'd since learned that Dennis Okafor, Rick's estate attorney, had tried gently to raise the marital issue with Rick more than once in his final year, and Rick had waved him off every time, choosing silence right up until the end. She said she was doing all right, that she'd sold the Sparks house and moved somewhere smaller, closer to her sister in Sacramento. I wrote back, I don't imagine we'll ever be friends, but I don't carry any bitterness toward her either. We were both, in our own separate decades, married to a man who found it easier to build something quietly in the dark than to have one uncomfortable conversation in the light. As for Rick, I think about him more than I expected to, honestly. Not with anger, not anymore. I think mostly about that unsigned decree, sitting in a courthouse file for 22 years, and about a man who apparently spent the last 14 months of his life knowing exactly what that meant, and choosing to fix it the only way he seemed to know how, not with a phone call, not with an apology, but with careful language buried in a trust document, hoping it would find me eventually, the way a man who's bad with words sometimes lets his actions say the things he never could out loud. I sit with Tyler sometimes on the back porch in the evenings now, and I think about what I'd actually tell another woman in my position if she called me up scared the way I was scared that first night in my kitchen. I'd tell her this: don't let anyone rush you into signing anything before you understand it completely, and don't let anyone, a lawyer on the phone, a grieving widow on your front walk, your own fear, talk you out of asking for the paperwork. The truth, in my experience, is almost always sitting in a file somewhere, waiting for somebody patient enough to go and read it properly. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story tonight, it's that you're allowed to be quiet and careful and thorough and still end up exactly where you deserve to be. You don't have to be loud to win. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to sign, refuse to panic, and keep asking for one more document. Has anything like this ever happened in your family? An old paper mistake that came back around decades later? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below, and if this one kept you company tonight, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.